The sharp words cut through the peaceful atmosphere of the cafe like shattered glass under pressure. "The tips don't belong to you girls. They belong to me," Rick Palmer, the manager, said as he swiftly snatched the bill from June Avery's hands. Her hands trembled slightly, but she could only silently stop, watching the money being taken from her without a word of protest. The entire cafe seemed to freeze, eyes lowered, as if the floor could swallow the shame that filled the room. June, with a forced smile, could only whisper a soft "thank you," almost like an act of surrender. No one spoke up to defend her. Silence, complete silence. In a corner of the cafe, John Hale sat, wearing a faded flannel shirt, his eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. His hand gripped the coffee cup so tightly that a vein popped out along his wrist. He didn't say a word. He simply observed, felt. Everything around him seemed distant, blurry, except for this moment, which was as sharp and clear as a knife cutting into his heart. The steam rising from the coffee cups, the squeaky sound of shoes on the old tiled floor, these were the familiar sounds everyone in the cafe faced every day. But for John, this atmosphere no longer felt like anything from before. It was empty, heavy, as if everything was slowly dying out. John's eyes didn't leave the glass jar behind the bar. It was covered in thick dust, the words "Team Building Fund," barely visible, faded by time. Yet no one in the cafe noticed it anymore. They kept chatting, paying, going about their lives. But that jar, and all that it symbolized, remained in John's sight. Everyone probably thought of him as just another random customer, no one important in the cafe. But John's eyes were not ordinary. They weren't the quick glance of a customer. They were deep, sharp as a knife, a gaze of someone who had lost too much, someone who could no longer ignore the injustice. And he knew that today, the truth would be exposed. The cafe continued as though nothing had changed. But for John, a storm had silently begun to brew. John Hale remained seated, his gaze still fixed on the jar. His eyes weren't just observing the layers of dust on it, they were seeing deeper, into what once existed, into what had been lost. This cafe, Morning Brew, the place where everything began, where he had placed so much hope, so much faith in creating a fair environment, a place where people could live and work with dignity. But now all that remained were the shattered remnants of memories. 15 years ago, in the early days, this cafe was a new beginning. John vividly remembered the feeling of hanging the "open" sign on the door for the first time. His fingers trembled not only from exhaustion, but also from pride. A small shop, a small world, yet brimming with hope. The chalk-written menu board, though crooked, clearly showed a commitment. Fair wages, honest work, no one left behind. The smell of fresh wood and the coffee he personally brewed, everything was simple yet filled with sincerity. That feeling was still fresh in John's mind, as though it had only been yesterday. He remembered his first customer, a girl with a wet umbrella, raindrops falling softly onto the rug. She smiled when she received her latte, and as she took the cup in her hands, she thanked him warmly. Thanking a stranger, thanking for something simple, yet filled with belief in the labor of another. John had responded with a wide smile, full of pride. At that moment, he felt like he had done something meaningful. And then, the laughter. The laughter of the first employees, young ones with little experience, but full of the belief that work here would be different. They wiped tables, brewed coffee, chatted together. Their laughter wasn't forced, it was the laughter of freedom, of belief in a better future. This cafe wasn't just a place to exchange money, it was a family. Each shift change, each tip left in the jar, belonged to those who earned it. No questions, no doubts. But now the laughter had stopped. The tip jar was covered in dust. No one paid attention to it anymore. What John had built, what he had once believed in, now lay in ruins. In these moments, John couldn't help but recall a memory. The first time he entered the cafe, a space filled with passion and hope. But now as he looked around, all that remained was a cold cafe, where fairness was merely a promise, and that belief seemed to have died. John Hale looked at the tip jar, but the feeling that washed over him was not peace. It was a deep, bitter sorrow. The atmosphere in the cafe seemed to freeze. Only the familiar sounds remained. The clink of cups on tables, the loud grinding of coffee beans, the footsteps of customers moving about. But to John, these sounds now felt like an oppressive silence, thick and suffocating, a deadly silence where everything was mute, yet full of stifling pressure. John couldn't take his eyes off June Avery, the young employee working diligently, persistently. However, something wasn't right. Although her exterior still held a calm and professional demeanor, in her eyes, John could see the exhaustion, the sadness that no one dared acknowledge. June no longer had any laughter, no joy. She worked each day with a forced smile, a smile that John knew was not genuine. The way she welcomed customers, the way she took care of every coffee cup, all of it showed that she no longer believed in fairness. Now it was just a habit, something she had to do in order to survive. John couldn't help but recall how June used to be, how she used to smile and work hard, just like the early days when he was still the owner. Back then, she had been one of the first to believe in his values, in fairness and respect in the workplace. But now that change wasn't just in her work. It was in the way she lived and felt about her job. Every step she took now was full of perseverance, but it seemed to be running out. She wasn't the person John had once known, someone who believed in the value of fairness. Now she was just a part of a system where everything was torn apart, suffocated in silence. Every time she smiled, John saw resignation in her eyes, a suffering no one could see. And it wasn't just June. It was the other employees too. Ida Marsh, a part-time worker, had eyes that John couldn't read anymore. She kept to herself, too afraid to look anyone in the eye. Only after work, when it was all over, did they let their guard down. But even in those moments, there was a strange tension, an unease that couldn't be explained. John could take it no longer. He felt like he was standing in a confined space, where every voice, every form of resistance was being silenced. The silence wasn't the peace of calmness, it was the silence of fear, and it had turned Morning Brew from a place of hope into a prison that would never open. And within that silence, he felt the cracks in his own soul. John Hale sat still in the corner of the cafe, his hand still gripping the coffee cup. But this time, it was no longer the familiar warmth he felt. It was an emptiness, a coldness. Each drop of coffee fell slowly, but in his heart, old memories surged powerfully, like a wave pulling him back to a past full of hope, full of dreams. He remembered the early days, when he had first opened Morning Brew, the little cafe he had poured his heart into building. The long months had passed, and the cafe had become more than just a place to enjoy coffee. It had been where he hoped to create a fair environment, a place where every employee was treated with the respect they deserved. He remembered the pride he felt when he first held the sign and painted the open letters on it, full of belief and longing. On that day, everything was new. The fresh morning air, the soft light coming through the windows, the fragrant coffee beans he roasted himself, the smell of the new wooden tables and chairs. Everyone laughed together, learned together, like a big family, a small community, but full of love and connection. He could still see the faces of his first employees clearly. They were young, maybe not yet skilled, but in their eyes, John saw belief, enthusiasm, and a desire to give their all. They believed in something greater than themselves. They believed in fairness, in a cafe where everyone could laugh, share, and work their hardest. Every tip that customers left was shared with the server, and no money was ever taken that didn't belong to them. But now all those things had slowly faded away. The cafe was no longer a place he had put his heart into. A silence had crept in, claiming every corner, every person, from employees to customers. They all bowed their heads, not out of fear anymore, but out of disappointment. They had become fully aware that everything had reached a point where it had to change. John couldn't help but ask himself, what had caused Morning Brew to become like this? What was the turning point when everything began to change? Not because of a natural progression, but because of poor decisions, greed, and the forces of power that had overshadowed everything? In June Avery's eyes, John realized something he didn't want to admit. The perseverance she now displayed was no longer the perseverance born of faith and hope. It was the perseverance of endurance. She had once been a symbol of freshness, of faith and justice, But now she was just a shadow of herself, only showing a forced smile and silent steps. John sat there, his eyes still fixed on the tip jar behind the bar, where the money customers left no longer served to encourage or support the workers as before. It had become a tool for Rick Palmer, the cafe manager, to exploit and hide his greed. The money was no longer seen as fair. It was now a reward for those abusing their power. Seeing all this, a nameless pain filled John's mind. He understood that he could no longer stand by and ignore the collapse of the values he had once built. A decision had to be made. He couldn't let his cafe, the place he had poured his heart into, continue to be suffocated by lies and greed. He had to act, and even though he knew it was a difficult decision, he knew that if he didn't do something now, he would lose everything he had built. The fire in his heart began to ignite again. His anger was not for himself, but for people like June. People who had given their all to their work, yet were not treated fairly. He couldn't let people like Rick Palmer continue running the cafe with the arrogance and cruelty they were practicing. The past and the present intertwined in John's mind, and he knew that the time had come to act, not only to save the cafe, but also to restore justice for those who had suffered too long. The coffee droplets slowly rolled over the rim of the cup, as quiet as the heavy thoughts weighing on John's mind. Though no one else seemed to notice, inside Morning Brew, a storm had begun to take shape. This storm wasn't brought on by strong winds or heavy rain, but by the accumulation of injustices, the pent-up frustrations that had been suppressed for so long. John could feel it, though no one spoke, but the heavy atmosphere engulfed everyone. His gaze still locked on June, the small girl who was busy with her work. Her gestures had become tired, yet persistent, without a single word of complaint, only a quiet resignation rooted in her self-respect. Every time Rick Palmer entered, he leaned lazily against the bar with his smug grin, while the tips from the customers, instead of going to the servers like June, were coldly diverted into the so-called team-building fund that no one truly understood. Rick felt secure in his false sense of power, but John knew once fairness was bent too much, it would eventually break. And today, the day the silence had waited for, was the day that John would break through the walls of silence and fear. In a fleeting moment, as his eyes briefly met June's, he felt a silent connection, an unspoken agreement that didn't need words. She knew he had seen it, knew he had recognized the exhaustion in her eyes. And in her eyes, he saw a glimmer of hope, like a faint light in the darkness. John took a deep breath, his hand still gripping the coffee cup. He could feel the injustice spreading through the room, like small cracks beginning to form on the floor. He knew that if he didn't act now, Morning Brew would continue to fall into darkness, losing everything he had once created. The whole cafe seemed to freeze, not because anyone spoke, but because something in the air had shifted. John stood up, walking toward the bar, his gaze sharp, unyielding in the presence of Rick. Each step he took was like a drumbeat echoing, reverberating through the space, signaling to everyone that the truth was finally going to be confronted. June looked at him, her eyes filled with a strange new light, as if she knew things would never be the same again. There was no more fear because John had arrived. The wrongs happening in the cafe would end. A silent war had begun, and no one could stop it. John didn't look at Rick, but his eyes subtly shifted toward the old tip jar, where the money once meant for the workers had become a tool for greed. That jar, with all its cruelty and deceit, had to disappear. And today it would no longer exist. But that wasn't why John hesitated. The storm coming wasn't a simple battle. It would be a battle of courage, of fairness, and of the belief that a community could rise again from its ruins. John knew that as soon as he stood up, as soon as he looked everyone in the eye, the things that had been buried would be brought into the light. And when he faced Rick, no words would be needed, only silence and the certainty in his eyes. That would be enough to make everything change. Each step John took in the cafe felt like a loud echo in the tense space. It seemed as though everything in Morning Brew had come to a standstill. There were no sounds of the coffee grinder, no clinking of cups, no chatter or laughter from customers. All eyes were on him, but no one dared to speak. Everyone knew something important was happening. Rick Palmer stood behind the counter, his face showing a hint of surprise when he saw John walking toward him. His usual smug smile began to fade, replaced with a growing nervousness he couldn't hide. John, however, didn't change his expression. His eyes remained fixed on Rick. John didn't say a word. He just stood there facing him, his hand still gripping the coffee cup, but his gaze sharp, like a knife. The storm had risen inside him, but he remained calm as though ready for a confrontation that had been a long time coming. Everything was silent, but the tension in the air was more suffocating than ever. The cups on the counter, the coffee machines, even the sound of each breath was drowned out. All that was left was a deep, oppressive silence, as if everything had converged at a single point, the moment when truth and justice would speak for themselves. Rick glanced around the cafe, looking at his employees, but no one dared to look him in the eye. Their heads were down, not out of fear anymore, but out of disappointment, out of the realization that everything had reached its breaking point. They understood that this was the moment, the time when no one could remain silent anymore, when no one could pretend everything was okay. "John," Rick said, trying to regain some confidence in his voice, but failing. He stopped, unable to continue. His eyes flickered toward the tip jar on the counter, where the money that was supposed to go to the workers had been taken by him. He was the one who had created this injustice. But now, facing John, he couldn't continue his lies. Everything had been exposed. John took another step toward the counter, but he didn't rush to speak. He let the silence linger, long enough for Rick and everyone in the cafe to feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't the words, but the silence that made the atmosphere unbearable. Finally, John spoke, his voice low and even, but enough for everyone in the cafe to hear clearly. "Today, I won't say much, but I want all of us to look at the truth. The money you've earned, the effort you've put into every shift, can't just be numbers that mean nothing. None of us deserve to be treated like this." Rick stood frozen, his hands gripping the counter, his face turning pale. He knew everything could no longer be hidden, but he couldn't admit it right away. June stood behind him, holding a coffee cup, but her eyes were focused on every move John made. She knew this moment would change everything. In her heart, a spark of hope suddenly ignited. She had endured too much, had suffered too long, and now something was starting to change. But not just for her, for all the workers at Morning Brew. They too saw John as a leader, as someone willing to stand up for them. Why? Because John wasn't just confronting Rick. He was confronting a system, a closed loop of greed and fear. And now that system was about to collapse. John continued, "Everyone here deserves to be respected. Every penny you earn deserves to stay in your hands for you to decide how to use it. No one has the right to take what you've earned. No one has the right to trample on your work." His words resonated through the silence. No one dared to look away. Each person in the cafe could feel the change taking place. They might not say it out loud, but they understood. Today was not just another day. It was the day they stood up for themselves. John looked directly at Rick, his eyes shining like a light cutting through the thick darkness. "We can't keep living in lies. Morning Brew will no longer be this place. This is not just a cafe, it's a family. And this family will stand up for justice." Rick could say nothing more. His excuses had been shattered, and now he couldn't defend himself. Every word of his was rendered meaningless. John turned to face the others, his gaze full of pride and determination. "Let everyone see that justice always wins, no matter how long it takes." Rick had nothing to say anymore. His power had been stripped away. John had done what needed to be done, and Morning Brew was no longer his domain. The air in the cafe seemed heavier than ever. The cups were still steaming, and the milk frother still hissed, but it couldn't dispel the cold that had settled between the employees and customers. Everyone was silent, afraid to breathe too loudly. Every eye, whether from the staff or the customers, was fixed on the counter, where John stood, radiating an unusual strength that no one could ignore. John still didn't say anything. He stood there, calm and resolute. Everything unfolded in slow motion, as if time had stopped in this very moment. The employees in the cafe all lowered their heads, but not with the same fear they once had. They began to realize something significant, a feeling they hadn't had in a long time: self-respect, and more than that, a burning desire to regain fairness. In that moment, something sparked in June's heart. She had lived for too long in resignation, putting in endless hours of hard work without any reward, with no one caring about the struggles she endured. But now, standing in front of change, she felt a power she never knew she had. She realized she had the right to demand justice. She felt the shift rising in her, slowly but steadily, coursing through her veins. John no longer looked at Rick. His gaze moved across the cafe, past Ida, who was standing behind, to Clive, who stood silently. He paused, offering a small smile to each of them, as if to say, "You're not alone. Today, none of us has to endure this injustice anymore," John said, his voice steady but full of certainty. "Everyone here deserves to be treated fairly, and I will do everything I can to make sure of that." Rick stood frozen, a look of surprise flashing in his eyes. A part of him wanted to fight back, but it no longer mattered. He could feel that the world around him had shifted. He no longer had power, not because John had taken it, but because his power was built on fear, on submission, and that was now broken. In that moment, silence enveloped the cafe like a blanket. But it wasn't a silence of fear. It was a silence of respect. Respect for John's courage, respect for what he stood for, and above all, respect for themselves, the people who had quietly endured for so long without a voice. John turned and looked at June, his eyes full of empathy. "June," he called softly, causing her to look up, startled. She met his gaze, her eyes wide with confusion. "Today, you won't just be a cafe employee anymore. You will be the leader of Morning Brew." His voice was gentle but heavy with significance, as if he was entrusting her with something monumental. June felt a wave of shock and dizziness, but deep down, she knew that this was the moment she had been waiting for. It was time for her to step out of the shadows and stand on her own 2 feet. She nodded, offering a weak smile, but in her eyes there was a new hope burning brightly. Ida stepped forward from the back, placing a hand on June's shoulder in solidarity, as if to say, "She deserves it." Clive stood beside them, saying nothing, but his gaze spoke volumes. This was not just a change for June, it was a change for everyone. "We will start over," John continued. "Every single penny you've earned over the past months will be returned to you. Not a single dime will be taken again. And from now on, every tip will go directly to the people who served, the people who deserve it." John's words felt like a firm promise, filled with strength. The employees no longer lowered their heads. They stood tall, and though they didn't speak, their regained self-respect was evident in the way they held themselves. Everything in the cafe had changed, from the atmosphere to the light. Morning Brew, once heavy and dark, now felt alive with a sense of justice, fairness, and freedom. Customers who walked in could feel the difference. The air in the cafe was no longer one of silence, pretense, or fear. People laughed and chatted freely, exchanging stories without restraint. They could sense that something had changed in the cafe. But that change wasn't due to a policy or a slogan. It was a change that stemmed from the people themselves, from their honest actions. And now, as John could clearly see the transformation in the staff and the customers, he felt an unusual satisfaction. He didn't need to speak anymore. This cafe had returned to what it was meant to be, a place where everyone could work and live with dignity, fairness, and above all, humanity. The money from the customers now went directly into the hands of the workers, and that was the value that Morning Brew had been missing for so long. As more customers came through the door, one of them, Grant Holloway, a familiar face, smiled warmly and repeated his usual line. "Thank you, June. You really make this cafe worthwhile." This time, June's smile wasn't just out of politeness. It was a smile of joy, a smile from someone who had been respected and appreciated. But this wasn't the end. The journey of Morning Brew wasn't just wrapped up in one event or one moment. It was an ongoing process that every person in this cafe, customers and employees alike, would have to continue to uphold fairness and respect for one another. John looked around one last time, silently thankful for the changes that had come. Not because of anything he had done, but because he had created a space where people could live and work as their true selves. Morning Brew was no longer a place of fear, where silence was the ally of power. It had become a bright space, where people could walk in without hiding who they were. A place where justice wasn't just an idea, it was a living, breathing action, carried out every day in the smallest gestures and actions. As the day passed and closing time neared, John quietly left his seat. He didn't say goodbye. There was no need to. He knew that Morning Brew had truly changed. What he had done, what he had seen today, was not just the salvation of a cafe. It was the restoration of belief in fairness and human dignity. He walked out the door, leaving behind a world that had been renewed, one where fear no longer existed, only freedom, trust, and kindness. The door to Morning Brew closed, but in the air, there was a powerful belief that justice, truth, and humanity would never again be crushed. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating a familiar space that had now changed. Everything in Morning Brew seemed to have begun a new chapter, one where fairness and human dignity were prioritized. No longer were there lowered eyes, forced smiles, or the frightening silence that had once filled the cafe. Everything had returned, but this time, with a renewed spirit. John sat in his usual corner, the spot where he had once sat as the owner. But today, that corner wasn't just his. It was the mark of a transformation everyone in the cafe could feel. He watched as his employees worked, and for the first time in a long while, they were all doing their jobs with confidence and belief in themselves. The air in the cafe was different now. June, now entrusted with the role of assistant manager, moved quickly from table to table, serving customers with not just skill, but with a genuine warmth she hadn't shown in a long time. She smiled at every customer, but this time, it wasn't a forced smile, nor one born out of obligation. It was a smile of someone who was respected and valued. The other employees weren't any different. Clive worked with ease, his hands no longer trembling as they once had. Ida Marsh, who had once lived in fear, now exhaled deeply, her eyes no longer darting around in worry when Rick came near. The cafe was no longer heavy with tension. It was no longer the place burdened by invisible rules that Rick had imposed. Instead, it was a vibrant, living space where each person could express themselves and be judged by their abilities, not by their submission. Customers who entered could feel the difference. The atmosphere wasn't one of silence, pretense, or fear. People laughed and talked freely, exchanging stories, their conversations full of joy. They realized that change was happening in this cafe. But it wasn't a change brought on by a policy or a slogan. It was a change that came from the people themselves, from their genuine actions. And now, as John could clearly see the transformation in the employees and the customers, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He didn't need to speak anymore. The cafe had returned to its rightful place, a place where everyone could work and live with dignity, fairness, and, most importantly, humanity. The tips from customers now went directly to the workers who earned them. And that was the value that had been missing from Morning Brew for so long. As customers continued to enter, one familiar face, Grant Holloway, smiled warmly and repeated his usual line. "Thank you, June. You really make this cafe worthwhile." This time, June's smile wasn't just a polite response. It was a smile full of joy, a smile from someone who had been seen, respected, and valued. But this wasn't the end. The journey of Morning Brew wasn't going to end with one event or one moment. It was a process, a continuous effort that every person in the cafe, from customers to employees, would have to maintain to keep the fairness and respect alive. John looked around one last time, silently grateful for all the changes that had taken place. Not because of anything grand he had done, but because he had created a space where people could live and work as their true selves. Morning Brew was no longer a place of fear, where silence had been an ally to those in power. It had become a bright space where people could walk in and not have to hide who they were. A place where justice wasn't just an abstract idea. It was a living, breathing reality, carried out every day in the smallest gestures and actions. As the day wore on and closing time approached, John quietly left his seat. He didn't say goodbye. There was no need. He knew that Morning Brew had truly changed. What he had done and what he had witnessed today was not just the salvation of a cafe, it was the restoration of belief in fairness and human dignity. He walked out the door, leaving behind a world that had been renewed, a world where fear no longer held sway, where only freedom, trust, and kindness remained. The door to Morning Brew closed, but in the air there was a strong, unwavering belief that justice, truth, and humanity would never again be crushed. The next day, as the first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the windows of Morning Brew, the cafe no longer held the same heavy, tense atmosphere it once did. The air was different now, lighter, filled with an undeniable sense of change. Everything seemed to have returned to normal, but it was a normal that carried a sense of anticipation, of something significant shifting. John sat in his usual corner, a place that once was his personal space in the cafe. But today, that corner wasn't just a seat for an ex-owner. It was a symbol of the transformation that had taken place. He watched his employees, who were now working with newfound confidence and belief in themselves. For the first time in a long while, the energy in the cafe felt different. June, now tasked with the role of assistant manager, moved swiftly from table to table, serving customers not only with skill, but with a sincerity she hadn't shown in a long time. She smiled at each customer, but this time it wasn't a forced smile or one out of obligation. It was a smile of someone who had been respected and valued. The other employees reflected this change too. Clive worked with more ease, his hands no longer trembling when he reached for the coffee cups. Ada Marsh, who had once lived in fear, now exhaled with relief, her eyes no longer filled with the anxiety she once had when Rick was near. Morning Brew was no longer a place of oppression. It was no longer burdened by the invisible rules Rick had imposed. Instead, it was a lively, vibrant space where everyone could express themselves and be judged by their abilities, not their submission. The customers who entered could feel the change too. The atmosphere was no longer one of silence, fear, or pretense. Conversations flowed freely, and laughter was genuine. People realized something was different at Morning Brew, but the change didn't come from a policy or slogan. It came from the people themselves, from their honest actions. And now, seeing the transformation in his staff and the customers, John felt a sense of quiet fulfillment. He no longer needed to speak. The cafe had returned to its true purpose, a place where everyone could work and live with dignity, fairness, and most importantly, humanity. The tips from customers were now going directly into the hands of the workers who had earned them. That was the value that had been missing from Morning Brew for far too long. As more customers came in, one of them, Grant Holloway, a regular, smiled warmly and repeated his familiar line, "Thank you, June. You really make this cafe worthwhile." This time, June's smile was not just a polite gesture. It was a smile full of joy, a smile from someone who had been respected and seen. But this wasn't the end. Morning Brew's journey wasn't going to be completed with just one event or moment. It was a process, a continuous effort that everyone in the cafe, staff, and customers alike would have to maintain to preserve fairness and respect for one another. John looked around one last time, silently grateful for all the changes that had taken place. Not because of anything extraordinary he had done, but because he had created a space where people could truly be themselves. Morning Brew was no longer a place of fear, where silence had been the ally of power. It had become a bright, welcoming space where no one had to hide who they were. It was a place where justice wasn't just an ideal, it was a living, breathing reality, carried out every day in the smallest of actions. As the day wore on and closing time approached, John quietly got up from his seat. He didn't say goodbye. There was no need. He knew Morning Brew had truly changed. What he had done and what he had witnessed today wasn't just the saving of a cafe. It was the restoration of belief in fairness and human dignity. He walked out the door, leaving behind a world that had been renewed, a world where fear no longer reigned, but where freedom, trust, and kindness thrived. The door to Morning Brew closed behind him, but in the air there was a powerful, unwavering belief that justice, truth, and humanity would never again be crushed. Thank you for following this story with us. If you found this video inspiring or it helped you see life in a new light, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any exciting and meaningful videos in the future. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next videos. Wishing you strength and confidence on your journey.